I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Now apparently deciding to go to work on that arm again. It's that same arm over the shoulder to which he's already applied such punishment. Down to the canvas, Bronco Nagurski goes once more. Watch him try and protect that arm if he can, but no, Jimmy Londos is too quick for him. He gets in there with the airplane whirl, slams him to the canvas again. It looks bad, ladies and gentlemen, for Bronco Nagurski. Watch the referee down there counting, and there is a new champion of the world, Jim Londos, who in his excitement and happiness jumps up and down like a rubber ball there, and in come his seconds and handlers, just as happy about the whole thing as he, as his hand is raised.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. What you just heard was commentary from, I believe it was a 1938 wrestling bout between Bronco Nagurski and the Golden Greek, Jim Londos. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, who is Jim Londos? Well, let me tell you something. Before there was Hulk Hogan, before there was The Rock, before there was Stone Cold Steve Austin, before there was Ric Flair, there was the Golden Greek, Jim Londos. He was one of the biggest stars of the Depression era, not just in wrestling, but in sports as a whole. And his story is not just of interest to pro wrestling fans. It's also a human interest story, a story of immigrant success and overcoming the odds. And yet, despite being one of the most recognizable and celebrated athletes of his time, Jim Londos has largely been forgotten today. His story has gone untold. This man was so much. He was an immigrant who made it in America. And he became an aspirational figure for many during the Great Depression. It really is a shame that more people don't know about his story. But journalist Steven Johnson aims to correct that with his new book, Jim Londos, The Golden Greek of Professional Wrestling. And I have to tell you, this book, wow. Whether or not you're a wrestling fan, I think you should pick this book up because it's a fascinating story. And it was really a labor of love on the part of Steven Johnson. He did years of research, going through archives, and then finally writing the story that needed to be told about the Golden Greek, Jim Londos. And he's going to be joining me on this edition of Parallax Views to tell that very story. So without any further ado, Steven Johnson, journalist and author of Jim Londos, the Golden Greek of Professional Wrestling. Buckle up, this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Whether or not you're a wrestling fan, I think you should give it a listen. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm really excited to be speaking with. I think we've been planning this episode for quite a long time, and we're finally doing it. I am so excited. This topic that we're going to be covering is kind of outside of what I usually cover. We're going to be talking about pro wrestling, but I think this covers more ground than even pro wrestling. And we're speaking with journalist Steven Johnson, who is the author of the book Jim Londos, The Golden Greek of Professional Wrestling, which is part of the Studies in Strength and Physical Culture series. How are you doing, Steven Johnson?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on. This is I love any chance to talk about something I worked on for about a dozen years.
Yeah, well, maybe we can get into this later on, but I guess a prior question I had for you before we get into the book itself is, I think a lot of times it's hard to get people to talk about pro wrestling today at times because I think it's still looked down upon by some as, oh, this is lowbrow. It's even harder to get people to talk about wrestling from 100 years ago. So how do you approach this and how do you sort of hook people in? Because I think that there is something important about pro wrestling. It's part of American culture. It's part of Americana. And I think through looking at the history of this wild profession that mixes athleticism with theatrics, we can actually learn a lot about the culture of America at various points in this country's history. I think there's a great deal we can learn from the history of professional wrestling. But how would you try to hook in people who maybe don't have an interest in professional wrestling to consider reading this book?
Well, there's a couple different things here. Number one, yeah, it's a book about a wrestler, but it's just as much as, a book about immigration patterns, Greek history, sports identity, intrigue, all those things kind of wrapped up together in his career, in Jim Londos's career. And then the other thing is, yeah, we dismiss wrestling today. I mean, wrestling is ubiquitous. You can't avoid it, even if you wanted to. But it's still kind of a stepchild of a sport. What's difficult to understand and explain is there's a time when that wasn't true. In the era of Jim Londos, in the 20s and the 30s, wrestling was one of the biggest sports in the country, right up there with prize fighting, horse racing, and baseball. That was kind of about it back then. So people are surprised when they look at this book or when I talk about the research that went into this book, and they find page width column headlines about Jim Londos's matches in the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Los Angeles Times. It was taken sometimes a little bit, tongue in cheek, but it was credible, it was legitimate, and it was dominant in the sports section of that time. So if you can kind of get people past that hurdle that, oh, it's just wrestling, you can see there's actually a whole lot more to it in terms of pop culture, like you were talking about. Then you throw in the story of Jim Londos, and if Horatio Alger had been writing about Greeks, he would have been writing about Jim Londos's rags to riches story. That kind of puts the package all together.
Before we get into who Jim Londos was, can you set the scene for us? So, a lot of this story takes place in the 1930s, and it's a very interesting period in wrestling because we're kind of past the era of, the William Muldoon style wrestlers that wrestled on the carnival circuit, but we're also not necessarily in the era of like Gorgeous George, where it's becoming much more theatrical. There's sort of this in between period where you see a mix of the theatrical and the sort of grappler heavy catch as catch can style. Can you set the scene? What was pro wrestling like at this point where Londos became the sensation of the wrestling world and sports in general?
Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of tape of that era, but what we do have shows you kind of the hybrid you're talking about, a little bit of theatrics. By theatrics, I mean maybe reaching out with a hand in a hole when you were in agony or something like that. I don't mean a top rope 540-degree Hurricane Rana. We're still mostly exchanging wrestling holds. A flying head scissors or a flying drop kick is about as aerial as it gets, which added at the time some degree of legitimacy to it. You and I watch AEW. It's great. And there are spots in AEW that take about 30 to 40 seconds to set up. And you just got to kind of sit there and wait. And WWE too, and wait for the guy to get his balance on the ropes, decide exactly what he's going to do, and make that move. That kind of thing was absolutely foreign to wrestling of the 20s and the 30s. So even if there were questions about its legitimacy back then, there was no, this has got to be fake. This is just an acrobatic show. So the style was intriguing enough with an amateur basis and a little bit of pixie dust of magic and theatrics mixed in to produce something that people enjoyed and paid, especially in the case of Londos, big, big money for.
And we'll get into that. Let's talk about the young Jim Londos, though, because I mean, he really is a classic immigrant story. And I do think that is a large part of why he was so popular, especially during the Great Depression. So he comes into America, I believe, is he a teenager? He comes in on a steamship, right?
He's 15, crossing the Atlantic for 3 weeks on a steamship. Now, most parents wouldn't let their kids go down the block without their cell phones in this day and age, right? But Londos's parents allowed him, with some reluctance, to cross the Atlantic on a steamship to America, a land where he really knew no one and had $20 in his pocket. But he had, I know this sounds like a cliche, but he had a dream. He had a vision. And so that kind of keyed him throughout his life, the idea that he was going to go to a new country and make something of himself. Londos would have been an amazing story in that sense, even if he never wrestled. Just the idea of a Greek immigrant coming and making something of yourself was amazing. What makes this particularly interesting is that about 390,000 Greeks immigrated to the United States between 1900 and 1924. By some estimates, Greece lost 7% of its population to overseas migration at that time. What was it about this one guy out of the 390,000 that he would become the most famous active athlete in the world during his time, and, not coincidentally, the highest paid active athlete during the Depression? How will you get from point A to point Z, zigging and zagging over a course of years, navigating treacherous professional wrestling promoter waters, is a really cool story. And it's not one that's replicable today, but it's one that does carry lessons today in persistence, determination, setting goals, and working to attain those goals, regardless of the circumstance you're in.
In terms of when he first comes to the United States, what are some of the adversities he faces? We don't even have to get into the wrestling aspect yet, but I did want to talk about what adversities he faced. I mean, I think this was still a time in America's history where there were sort of nativist sentiments that would have led to xenophobia and discrimination against immigrants, including Greek immigrants. So, did he face challenges like that?
Sure, absolutely. Um, if you go back and look at some of the newspapers of the era, look at the want ads for jobs or residences, and you'll see line after line in newspapers, no Greeks need apply. No Greeks need apply. No Greeks need apply. It was in 1922, because of the anti-Greek sentiment in the US, fostered in part by the KKK, that the Greek organization AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, was formed. The feeling against Greek immigrants was that strong, and of course against all immigrants in that post-World War I period, when the U.S. kind of shut down its borders. So he faced that as a problem. Number two, he faces a problem of finding some kind of work to do. When Londos came as a teenager and ended up settling in California, he had a couple of bucks. He could do one of two things. He could use his $5 earnings on the railroad to join a gym, or he could learn to take English lessons. He decided to join the gym. Yeah. Um, he would he said in many places over the years that the language barrier for him coming up was difficult communicating things. There's a couple of incidents in the book when in the book where he just could not communicate to a promoter what it was he wanted to do, or how he was going to do it. So he ends up taking a series of menial jobs, and by menial I mean, menial with a capital M, um, to try and scratch out a living, all the while continuing to insist he's going to be a professional wrestler. And then the final challenge, and it's one that I had no idea about when I started this, was his dad. His dad essentially disowned him when he came to the US and announced he was going to be a professional wrestler. Um, that created a fire that burned within him for a good quarter century. The idea that My dad has disowned me. He thinks professional wrestlers are bums. Londos changed his name in part because of that, because his father didn't want him to be a part of the family anymore. There's no greater fuel than trying to prove your parents wrong. So you take all those challenges together, and you can see by the time he got up in the morning to start exercising at 6 a.m. to the time he hit the sheets in bed at midnight, that he was facing sort of one challenge after another, whether it was self-imposed or coming from the outside world.
How important is that sort of father-son element? You know, the father disowning the son over, his son wanting to be a pro wrestler. How important do you think that is to the story of Jim Londos?
Like I said, when I started, I really didn't realize it to that degree. But as I went back and read Londos's interviews, especially ones he conducted in Greece, you realize that it was a core element of everything he did, that he needed to win championships in his mind to please his dad and prove that he was worthy of being his son. I know that almost sounds like a Walt Disney movie kind of creation. You know, the son is working to please the dad, but it really, really bothered him. And he did not go back to Greece after coming to the United States for about 20 years. And the relationship with his father really did not improve for about a quarter century when he finally wrestled that famous match in Athens that drew, I say, around 90,000 people. And his father could see that his son was not only a champion, but a borderline deity in his native country.
Could you talk about? I'm curious. So, what was the world of wrestling like in the years leading up to Jim Londos becoming a big star? Because I'm assuming he was aware of figures like Stanislaus Zbyszko or the Indian champion, the Great Gamma. I mean, there was wrestling before Londos, but I think he brought something completely new to the table in terms of it's strange. He's almost like a Greek heroic figure, a mythology figure on one hand. For the women, he's like a matinee idol. You know, he's all of these different things rolled up into one.
He had a really good sense of audience. Yeah, there's no question about it. He had a good-looking physique, so guys want to look like that. He had a good-looking physique, so female fans were impressed by that. He had the ethnic appeal to Greeks. He had the underdog appeal because he was a small guy, 5'8", 200 pounds. Underdog appeal to folks who were down on their luck and out of work at the Depression. So he spanned probably more audiences than anybody in his time. You have to remember, though, he's doing this with a few handicaps, right? He's got no social media. He's got no TV. He's got no weekly television show on Monday night or Saturday afternoon. He has no set alliance like we think of the National Wrestling Alliance or WWE. He's pretty much doing this, especially in his early years, on his own, barnstorming by himself. And that's why, if you look at his early years, you find Londos in places like Burlington, Iowa, Butte, Montana, Bandon, Oregon. Not exactly wrestling hotbeds of the world, but they were places where he could find employment, usually more in terms of quarters than dollars, to pursue what he was doing. So the way you describe what he was doing at that era was really barnstorming, going from place to place to see what he could find, hoping that he could work his way up to the top line with the Ed Lewis and Joe Stecker and Stanislaus Zbyszko, the world champions. But remember, they weren't wrestling 365 days a year like Ric Flair. They're wrestling maybe once, twice a month. If there's a card, there may only be one or two matches on it. There's no loaded card of 6 or 8 matches. So the opportunity to earn a living by doing wrestling in the 1910s, 1920s, unless you were one of the really, really big top stars, um, was difficult, and that's why Londos pursued it, but at the same time, he always had his hand trying to make a few bucks working in the fields, working in quarries, doing posing exhibitions. So it was a very different world than it is today.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because even I've known wrestlers from the past that were wrestling in the 70s or 80s. Even guys like George the Animal Still, he used to wrestle in Pittsburgh when my dad was growing up. He was like a gym teacher on his non-wrestling days. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that even back then, in the 30s, a lot of these wrestlers had to have day jobs.
I'll tell you what one of the things that struck me. Even today, we talk about the need for wrestlers to quote unquote pay their dues before they hit the big time. And everybody has wrestled for a low payoff at some county fair show or wrestled for a six pack. And that's paying your dues. Okay, that's true. But in Londos's time, paying your dues was coming across the Atlantic on a steamship, hoboing in a rail car to go someplace to work for 75 cents.
He hoboed in
That's,
a rail car?
yeah, that's really paying your dues. He lived in a rail car from time to time, didn't have any place to live. Uh, when he worked on the railroad, he'd sleep in the rail car. He'd sleep in fire stations because he didn't have any place to stay. Always a nice, comfy place to stay in a fire station. That is paying your dues. But again, that gets back to what we were talking about before. You want to talk about determination and persistence in the face of having very little to play with. Man, that's amazing that you would fight through all that and continue to go for what you view to be the prize.
Now, one thing I think we have to get into, I think my listeners would be very interested. In today's day and age, I think a lot of people, if they wanted to, they could go online and find a wrestling school if they wanted to become a wrestler. If you're a kid in your 20s, that wasn't around back then, and it was a very closed off world. In some ways, wrestling is still a closed off world. If you're an outsider, it's different than if you're inside the business. But back in the 1920s and 30s, it was really a closed off world. So, how does Jim Londos break into this world?
That's a great question because there was no WWE Performance Center in 1920. Now, in a way, that was a good thing because that meant there were no cookie cutter styles of wrestling coming out where everybody's doing the same thing, working the same way. In his case, he was fortunate to fall into three trainers. One was a gentleman named Pete Bazookas, who was a part-time wrestler and a part-time hustler, to put it mildly. He worked with Londos, showed him a lot of things on the mat, helped him get booked. Another was Dutch Mantel, not the Dutch Mantel we know today. This is the original Dutch Mantel. He, like Londos, was an immigrant. He had a lot of connections in terms of booking people in theaters and vaudeville shows. He helped Londos along those lines, helped market him. And then Londos had a third manager, a third trainer named Jack Donovan, who was an ex-wrestler and a circus performer with what we would know as Barnum and Bailey. He helped Londos get less muscular and more refined through his training methods, and also used him in some of his vaudeville shows, so that Londos is being exposed to an audience for the first time, learning how to move an audience through theatrics, and then starting to be able to incorporate that in wrestling. So it's kind of like this mass apprenticeship with three guys in particular, who showed him the ropes of how to get into the business. He was fortunate in that direction. I spent a lot of time on some of those guys in the books because they are really interesting stories, but it's very easy to see if he doesn't hook up with one of those guys, maybe we're sitting here talking about, you know, space ghost memories from the 70s instead of wrestling.
Can you talk a little bit more about those characters? Because a character like the original Dutch Mantel, or some of these other characters that you've mentioned, like Jack Dodd, They're very colorful characters. This whole world of pro wrestling in the 1930s attracted very colorful, oftentimes somewhat shady, maybe characters. And can you talk a little bit about that, the type of characters he would have been encountering?
Sure, let me talk a little bit about Pete Bazookas because he was um, instrumental with Londos. He preceded Londos by a few years on the West Coast, got to know Londos working out in gyms. We should throw in here, Londos was an outstanding amateur wrestler. His name was all over the papers for being an outstanding amateur. Didn't have college wrestling and AAU wrestling like they did today, but he was probably the top light heavyweight amateur on the West Coast at that time. So it wasn't like he was coming out of nowhere. So a guy like Pete Bazookas, who's a born hustler, sees him and says, "Hey, here's an opportunity to get somebody in the business and make some money." Pete Bazookas was a Greek immigrant who lived for two things: wrestling and swindling people. And he would go from town to town trying to set up matches for himself, inducing the local folks to bet on him. And then he would manage to get himself disqualified or run out of the match. Um, they'd be left holding the bag. He would have taken whatever money he could and bet on his opponent. Also, was known to take a few diamonds from any hotel that he could along the way. He got arrested more than, oh, let's move it up, more than Dr. Jerry Graham. Pete Bazookas was in constant trouble with the law. Now, how much of that rubbed off on Londos? I don't know. Um, Londos credited him with helping him throughout the years, but you ran into these shady characters. The wrestling world was not exactly a community of choir boys. So if you wanted to get ahead, you had to go along to get ahead. And so you go along with these guys. Um, Maybe there was something suspicious about the way the betting occurred. Um, but in the end, that was probably the only thing you could do to advance your career, short of being Strangler Lewis or maybe Zabisco or Joe Stecker. We should throw in here, if we're describing this period, and I'm writing about this for another publication. Betting was a big deal on pro wrestling at the time. I mean, who would bet on wrestling these days? I don't know, maybe FanDuel or DraftKings would. But remember, the payoffs for these shows in the 1910s, 1920s were pretty small. You know, it was certainly not a full-time occupation. So what money you made usually came in the form of bets being placed on the match, whether they were in public or they were side bets under the table. That goes back into the 1880s in terms of the way wrestlers and promoters made their money. I don't think any wrestler, Lewis or Londos or anybody else, was immune to that. Either betting on yourself to win or betting on yourself to lose, or trying to work the crowd up and increase the size of the bets. Frank Gotch, the great idol of the history of wrestling, went through Alaska one time under an assumed name, doing nothing but ringing up tens of thousands of bets so he could make a few bucks. It adds up to a scene in wrestling at that period of time where you had to watch your back. You needed to be able to defend yourself in case things went south in a hurry. Londos was pretty good at that. Lewis was pretty good at that. But there was always the danger of a double cross or a screw job, or God knows what else might happen. Somebody pulling a knife on you, that made the wrestling of that era a little different from what it is when we watch Saturday night's main event.
Yeah, I wanted to talk more about that because I'm blanking out on the specific wrestler, but there was one incident. I think it was Joe Savoldi did a double cross on
Yes.
Jim Londos. Can we talk about this because it's really interesting. I think when people hear about double crosses in wrestling, they think, oh, that started with that Bret Hart Shawn Michaels in '97. And no, it was happening even back then. Probably happened with more frequency too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The double crosses go back to the 19th century. But here's the key. The world championship was worth a lot of money in those days. Okay, it was the world championship. That's how you made money as champion. It wasn't like you were WWE champion and you were signed to a 3-year contract at $10 million per. That belt was worth a lot of money. So there were several double crosses or screw jobs before that. In 1933, Londos met Joe Savoldi in Chicago. It was a big day. It was the day that Chicago dropped prohibition. People were celebrating. And Londos was the victim of a fast count by a paid-off ref. Referee uh, Bobby Manigoff Sr. counted Londos out silently, not verbally. He'd been paid off and proclaimed Joseph Oldie world champion. And Londos protests loudly that this isn't the way the match was supposed to be. He didn't even have me in a pinning position. He had him kind of on the side, laying on one shoulder, and all of a sudden the match is over. That was a common thing in those days. Londos predicted it would happen to him, and he also predicted accurately there wasn't anything he could do about it because if you complain, people would say, that's just sour grapes. So you constantly fought that double cross issue when it came to the world championship.
Now, if we could, you mentioned earlier a match that he had in Athens, and I believe this match was October 22nd, 1933, at the Panathenaic Olympic Stadium in Athens, Greece. And
Right.
it was Jim Londos versus Kala Quarian, and I may be mispronouncing that. My
Yeah.
apologies. But this is
Kolakoriani.
like, okay, this is like, people talk about WrestleMania. This was like WrestleMania Zero. This was WrestleMania before WrestleMania. And I want you to give a picture of this event because I don't think people realize that there's this idea that some people have that before Hulk Hogan, wrestling was all just in smoky little rooms. And that's not always the case. And I think we can see that with Londos and his performance in Athens, Greece. Can you speak to that?
Sure. This is one of the most famous matches in history among people who actually follow wrestling, and I wish it was one of the most famous matches in history among even general wrestling fans. So Londos is returning in 1933 to Greece for the second time. He came back in 1928. Now he's coming back in 1933. The situation was that he had a version of a championship belt, enough to be able to claim that he was world champion. But he really wanted to return to Greece to wrestle in front of his native countrymen and in front of his father, who was getting up there in years. They're wrestling at the Olympic Stadium. If you look at the old pictures from the Olympics in the early 1900s, that's the classic white marble bench Olympic Stadium. It was in Athens a holiday for a week. It's funny to go back. I went through all the Greek newspapers of the time with the help of my very able researcher and translator, Vicky Mutzari. And it's amazing to see the buildup to this match. Not only was Londos's title or his reputation on the line, Greece's prestige was on the line. Londos, in that time, 1933, representing a country that had had more than its share of problems over the years, was the embodiment of the Greek ideal. The match is held at the Panathenaic Stadium. It seats 60, we know it seats 60,000 people. Ticket takers were ripping tickets, and ticket sellers were ripping tickets in half, selling 2 tickets as one. Gate crashers were going through an hour and a half before the stadium was even open. The estimate in the newspapers varies, but the firmest one that I think I'm comfortable saying, and is maybe conservative, is that there were 70,000 people in a 60,000 seat stadium. They didn't have any seats on the infield. They could have fit another 15 or 20,000 seats on the infield. They just didn't do that in those days. The stadium is sunk into a valley. So the cheap seats are the hillside around the stadium. There's another 20,000 people at least, maybe more, looking down, kind of like the people used to look at the Chicago Cubs games from the apartments across from Wrigley Field. Yeah. The Knothole gang. So you have about 90,000 people watching this epic struggle between Londos and Coriani, and they'd fought many times in the U.S. They were not unfamiliar with each other. Um, and people are so emotionally invested in it, they're passing out in the stands. Okay, there's when Coriani grabs the upper hand, the hands go over the mouth. They're silent. They're praying. There's a quote in there from one person, Jim, mother of God, help Jim. That's how emotionally invested they were. So when we talk about emotional investment in WrestleMania, yeah, that's people care and that's great, but the emotional investment was nothing like it was then. That was obviously the largest in-stadium attendance until WrestleMania 3. I know the figures are up and down on what that was, but it's safe to say that attendance held for half a century. Okay? And there's a few very minor video clips of the event on YouTube where you can see the people filing into the stadium, rows and rows and rows of people just
Yeah,
filing in.
you can see the attendance essentially
Yeah,
by watching these videos that you're
it is.
talking about, and it's incredible. Like
And
people don't realize it, but this was mainstream.
there's a couple of videos where they have kind of a wide shot of the stadium, and it's a humanity. It's a massive humanity. It's nothing that had ever occurred in sport to that time, and it would be a long time before anything like that would occur in sport. And I wrote in the book, and I've said in other places, trying to translate it to today, World Cup, that kind of atmosphere, that kind of intensity, and that kind of crowd. I would skip WrestleMania and go to the World Cup because of the way it truly is in and it was in the hearts of the fans then and would be in the hearts of the fans in World Cup events today.
And this, just to be clear, I want my listeners to really understand this. This was not the only big event he did. He was getting crowds of 20,000 people, at various places. He sold out Madison Square Garden. Can you speak to just how popular he was? Because I think people, again, they assumed that, oh, wrestling before the 80s was just small little events in smoky rooms. With Londos, that's not the case.
Let me just rattle off some of the stuff that I keep up here for these things because it's really interesting. And the best way to do it is kind of just give examples. Okay. He's the first person to draw a crowd of 40,000 people anywhere. Okay. For the match in Athens, like I said, maybe 90,000 people. He was somewhat limited compared to today in terms of the absolute crowds he could draw because they didn't have big arenas back in the 1930s. You had Boston, you had Madison Square Garden, but the 20,000 seat arenas that you see today in places like San Antonio or Charlotte or the Alamo Dome or these things, they didn't exist back then, so you had to deal with what you could. Here's what he did with Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden ran 3 shows in the 20 months before Londos won the world title for the first time in 1930. Those shows were headlined by Ed Lewis and Joe Stecker. They drew 2,000 and 4,000 people to the Garden. In Londos' first 4 shows as champion, he drew 20,000 plus. 10 times, 10 times as many. And in his second match, the Garden police were so unprepared that people just kind of rushed to their seats and they let them sit anywhere they could because they were tearing the place apart. That's unheard of. No boxer, no wrestler drew that kind of crowd at that time. His salary in that era was estimated at about $185,000 a year. Babe Ruth's highest year was $80,000 a year. Okay. He's making more than Babe Ruth, but then again, he had a better year than Babe Ruth did. Um, so from 19, I'll finish 1926 to 1934, he drew 62 crowds of at least 10,000 people. Um, no one else drew more than 16. So was, you know, I would never diminish Hogan's drawing power or Flair's drawing power or anybody else's. They're hellacious draws. Okay. Londa set the standard for that a long time ago under different circumstances. You can't necessarily compare apples to apples, but you can say that the apples that Londa's had were big and juicy and ripe and full of juice.
So it's interesting. I want to talk more about how he appealed to audiences. I was going to say maybe this is a weird comparison to make, but I think with women, he was almost like it sounds like he was almost like a Rudolph Valentino character. Women loved him, just thought he was a heartthrob. And I guess men loved him for different reasons. And that's a hard thing to balance, like getting both the men and the gals to be a fan. How do you think he worked that?
Let me go to a modern day example that maybe is a good comparison. A guy who wasn't the biggest or necessarily the most talented at what he was doing, but drew across lines like that, and that's Oscar de la Hoya, right? The Golden Boy. He had that appeal to ethnics, to men, and to women that Londos had. Mayweather might have been a better boxer and more obnoxious. He might have fit in better with Strangler Lewis that way, but Londos had sort of those intangibles and knew how to work an audience like nobody's business. I think those are some of the key elements in being able to have that cross-cultural appeal.
I was going to say too, another thing that stands out to me about Jim Londos is, my dad grew up in the era after Londos, so he grew up watching Bruno Sammartino from Pittsburgh, and it's interesting the way my dad describes it. Bruno was someone you looked up to as an Italian American that faced adversities. As an Italian American, you could sort of live vicariously through the Italian Hercules, Bruno Sammartino. And that was the same for Latin American audiences with Pedro Morales, or African Americans with Bobo Brazil. And I feel like that was a huge part of professional wrestling in the territory days, was the sort of immigrant success story, or a person from a marginalized community sort of becoming the champ. And I think that's part of the appeal of Jim Londos. I assume there were probably kids that were like living vicariously through Londos. How important is the sort of immigrant aspect to his success? He's the Greek who made right and became champ.
I think it's a fundamental part of who he was and why he was successful. I'll give you an example because I grew up with Bruno too. You might have had 4 or 5 matches on the card and they were entertaining and they were good. Now we're up to the main event. Here comes Bruno down the aisle. You've got to hush over the crowd, okay? There's nobody in the aisle reaching out to touch Bruno or to grab Bruno or to slap his hand. You don't do that. You came to admire him. You came to gaze. You came to respect him. Same thing with Londos. You would not have tugged at his cape as he walked to the ring or tried to glad hand him. You were there to see the spectacle. That's really, really important. Bruno carried himself in a particular way. Londos carried himself in a particular way. Once you have the audience buying into that, then you're starting to get them down the road to caring. So you can relate those things together. What I've said about Londos, and this is if there's anything folks can take from our little talk here today, I put it very early in the book. When we talk about pro wrestling, wrestlers always talk about trying to make people believe it's real. Okay? Johnny Valentine used to say that. They might not think it's real, but I can make them believe it's real, okay? By the use of his holds and his personality. Londos is a step beyond that. Believing it was real, yeah, that's okay. But what Londos did better than anyone before him, and very few since, is he made people care. And there's a difference between caring and believing. I can believe wrestling looks real, and I don't particularly care about the match. Okay? I can believe that Johnny Valentine was hammering on the mighty Igor, but I didn't give a hoot about the match. Londos, on the other hand, I cared about him. Fans cared about him. They had an emotional investment in him. They had a personal attachment to him, whether it was because of his looks, his Greek identity. So being able to make people care about yourself and by extension, the outcome of the match was a trait that he had that I think still has relevance today in 2025. One of my favorite stories in the book, and I just dug it up somewhere. When Londos wrestled, he was a storyteller. We always talk about storytellers in wrestling today, but he was a storyteller too, an undersized Greek immigrant, usually taking a pounding before he made his comeback. Yeah. That's a formula that's been going on in wrestling since the time of Cain and Abel. But Londos, when he made his comeback, didn't make his comeback by grabbing the guy, jumping on top of the ropes, and pounding him in the head 10 times. He made his comeback with holds and counter holds. That's, to me, a really important distinction because what Londos is subtly telling the people at ringside who are down on their luck and maybe out of work or struggling in their own lives, he's saying, look at me. I'm an undersized guy. I don't speak great English. I'm kind of like you. I'm in a really difficult predicament. But what I'm doing is using my mind, okay, and my resourcefulness to try and overcome that situation. I'm not standing up here and punching the guy 10 times and having the audience count with me. I'm applying a hold or a counter hold or a reversal that puts me on top of the situation. That's, boy, what better lesson was there for people during the Depression than that? So one of the stories I have in the book is a Pennsylvania coal industrialist who watched Londos wrestle for the first time, came up to him after the match and said to him, and I'm paraphrasing, but the quote's in the book, "Tonight, you taught us how to control our own destiny." Man, that is so powerful, and that gets at that fundamental distinction between caring and believing.
So we have to talk about this because you mentioned it, and I feel like I almost glossed over it, didn't talk about it enough earlier in the conversation. He's probably the most famous athlete in the world during the Great Depression. How much does the Great Depression loom over this narrative of his life? How much does it figure into your book? How important is it to understand the career of Jim Londos and the peak of his career within the context of the Great Depression?
Hey, it's easy to be the representative of a business when business is going good, right? Right? We know that. To be the representative of a business when you're in the worst economic times ever, and you're a Greek immigrant to boot, is a whole nother matter. I insist, having done the research on this all these years, that if Londos had flopped and the business had gone south and wrestling had ended up like roller derby, maybe the immigrants who followed him, Rocca and San Martino and Carpentier and so forth, wouldn't have had the success that they enjoyed because promoters would say, that guy from overseas, we tried him, that was a flop. Yeah. So in terms of the Depression, he's giving hope to people who are paying their hard-earned dollars to sit at ringside and watch him, to the point where early on in the Depression, 1930, 1931, you actually see newspapers writing stories that say wrestling is the biggest moneymaker in sports today. Well, baseball was cutting salaries, while football was contracting, wrestling was expanding. And it's expanding because certainly you're not going to attribute every single thing to him, but he's the leader in the industry. He's the one who's taking it in that direction. And he does that in the United States. And then when he goes on a world tour in 1936 and 1937, bringing his style of wrestling to South Africa, the former Rhodesia, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, England, France. I may be forgetting something in there. You can truly say he is the wrestler to the world.
Yeah, and I think the important thing for me is maybe I think you would agree with this is I think he was this powerful lightning rod for people. He's because he's an aspirational figure in a time where times are tough.
He's going to Cyprus in 1937. They've been waiting for him for 4 years. Cyprus was under British rule at the time. British rule is weak. British domination at the time. When he came to Cyprus, he was hailed almost as a folk hero that people are seeing in him. You're right, aspirational. This is the kind of guy that we aspire to be, the kind of person that we emulate, that we'd like our kids to be, and who can help us understand ways in which we can escape our daily lives. That's a pretty amazing thing. Uh, and I think he was fully aware after about 1928, after his first trip to Greece, that people were looking at him as more than just a wrestler.
Well, I think when he went back to Greece, there were like celebrities and politicians that wanted to be pictured with him. It was a big deal to be around him.
Yeah, we call it the rub today, but every prime minister of Greece, every time Londos is in the country, I need a photograph with this guy. I need to stand next to this guy. In 1937, when he was in Greece, fighting Johannes van der Walt in the Panathinaik Stadium, another massive crowd, he's walking in with Ioannis Metaxas, who was actually the dictator of Greece at the time. Anytime a dictator is walking next to you trying to get your rub, uh, you're in a pretty good position.
So, it's interesting. I know elsewhere you've called Jim Londos the Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan, and I do think that's apt. It's like I think it's unfair that people that are unaware of the history of the profession really don't know about Jim Londos. I think he deserves to be recognized, not just as a pro wrestler, but as a cultural figure. But what I was going to say is, in a way, he's not just Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan. He's sort of the precursor to a lot of wrestlers we see today that fight as the underdog. He is a precursor to the Daniel Bryan or the Eddie Guerrero, the Shawn Michaels, even the Bret Hart. These guys that are maybe smaller than a Hulk Hogan, but they gain popularity. Do you think that's an apt comparison on my part?
Yeah, JG, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I've been asked over the last few months since this book came out, could Londos succeed today? Well, the short answer is he had a 45-year career and was the biggest moneymaker, understood audiences better than anybody. He'd figure out a way. Who would you compare Londos to today? Daniel Bryan. Undersized, an excellent technical wrestler, a really good ear for the audience, willing to adapt to what he needs to be. Remember, Londos would wrestle as a heel if he needed to wrestle as a heel. I think that would be a really good comparison. He made the landscape safe for little guys because previously, before him, most of the world champions were the big, strapping country boys, all-American, red-blooded types like Strangler Lewis and the original Strangler Lewis. So he really uh, changed that dynamic in a way. So I think he'd succeed today just along the lines that you're talking about. I'll throw in one other thing too about Londos and Hogan. I asked JBL to write the forward, and
John Bradshaw Layfield, and I enjoyed that forward.
yeah, and to anybody listening, the forward's worth the price of the book. It's an amazing piece. I knew he'd do a great job, and he surpassed my expectations. Um, because he's in Londos's lineage, right? They're both world champions. It's a shaky lineage, but you can make that trace from Londos to JBL. But he did a tremendous job of explaining the wrestling that he grew up with, the wrestling that he was part of with WWE, and how that's still related back to Londos. And at the end, without spoiling the end of the forward, I hope people can get out there and read it. He explains who he would most like to face among all the wrestlers in the history of the sport.
I think listeners can figure out who you want to face.
That's right.
If you can go a little bit longer, I had some things I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into,
Sure.
particularly his feud. This is the biggest feud, I think, for a lot of people when you talk about Jim Londos, the feud with Ed the Strangler Lewis, because he's chasing Lewis for years and Lewis is ducking him at every corner. Let's go deep dive into this.
Ed Lewis and Jim Londos were like Ali and Frazier 40 years earlier. They didn't like each other. They were total opposites in many ways. Lewis was a big, strong, strapping Midwest good old boy who probably never met a party he didn't want to be part of and was known to knock back quite a few beverages in his time. Londos was a quiet, studious, serious Greek immigrant who only ate certain foods at certain times of day. They could not have been more different. They both had the same goal, and that was to be the champion of the world and to occupy the top spot in wrestling. Over the course of a 17-year feud, which had a 10-year hiatus because they couldn't agree on a way to meet each other, Londos and Lewis became the dominant feud in wrestling and maybe one of the dominant feuds in the history of sports. Lewis was on top when Londos broke in. He was a few years older than Londos, and there's no question that Londos kind of viewed Lewis as the guy I need to get by to achieve my dream for myself, my father, and my country. There's no question that Lewis viewed it as, I'm not going to let this little Greek son of a bitch knock me off the top perch here. And I talked to some folks who talked to Lewis over the years, and he didn't like Londos in any way, shape, or form. Anyway, they fought repeatedly for about 6 years, including a match in St. Louis where Lewis entered the ring with the eye disease trachoma, which can cause blindness and did eventually cause blindness in him, and panicked Londos that he was in the ring with him in those kinds of unsanitary conditions. That was something I chanced upon from a medical journal, and there's no question that that only antagonized the feud further. Londos was very sensitive about trachoma. He suffered from it for a little while. He invested his life savings in a cure, and you don't want to know the cure for that at that time because it was rough. So he thought Lewis was costing him his career by wrestling him in unsanitary conditions. On and on this went, neither one kind of willing to barge. They started creating their own versions of world championships so they could kind of proclaim themselves as world champions. That being a theme in wrestling, whoever's champion just announces their champion. Until they finally agreed to meet in 1934 in what I called the match of the century, and it was the match of the century in Chicago.
This is the match that even I think Arch Ward, the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, was involved in making it happen. So this is mainstream stuff. Let's talk about that.
That is mainstream. Finally, in 1934, Londos more or less has the claim to the world championship, but he needs a victory over Lewis to certify himself as the true champion. Lewis, at that time, is getting a little paunchy, a little older. His restaurants are failing. He needs a big payday. So they finally agree to meet. Arch Ward, the editor of the Chicago sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, the man who created the baseball all-star game and the NFL college all-star football game, which they no longer held, was the one who put the match together in Chicago in September 1934. we really don't look at wrestling title bouts or boxing title bouts the way we did maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where there were month-long build-ups to the match with tales of the tape in the paper every day. Um, this, though, was hyped like no other match had been in history, holding it in Wrigley Field in 1934. Uh, each wrestler, Londos and Lewis, kind of went on a slow build over opponents to peak themselves for the match, got into Chicago around Labor Day, actively trained in public for several weeks before the match to show you how seriously this thing was being taken before they actually agreed to meet in the ring. The interesting thing is that the Chicago Tribune had a newspaper syndicate at the time, still does, where articles that would appear in the Tribune would be syndicated throughout little papers across the country. So if you go back to the newspaper archives of the time, you find the discussions of the Londos-Lewis match being discussed in just about every paper in the country. This was a national event, huge national event. Everybody is aware of it. Um, I know it's hard to think of a modern day wrestling equivalent of that, but it was taken as a legitimate. These guys are finally fighting each other once and for all. Not exactly a Texas death match, but certainly a battle to the wills. The interesting thing is, by this point, the animosity is so great between Londos and Lewis, having built up over a period of more than a decade, that they're really not fighting for the world championship. They're fighting for the championship of each other. And so they enter the ring in 1934 in Wrigley Field. 35,600 fans, more attendance records. The gate fell just short of $100,000. 1934, we would not finally have a $100,000 gate until 1952 to show you how long the box office records were set. And they went at it in a very slow-paced, deliberate match. Meltzer wouldn't give it 5 stars. Okay. Nobody would give it 5 stars, but that was irrelevant. It was the most important match in wrestling to that point. Yeah. We're not looking for work rate or top rope hurricane ranas. We're looking for these two cautious veterans who didn't trust each other. How are they going to wrestle? Is it possible one of them might shoot on the other one? Entirely possible. They wrestled a match that, by all descriptions, and there are a lot of accounts of the match, looked pretty darn close like a shoot. There were no high spots. They went more than a dozen minutes before they even went to the mat for the first time. Yeah.
That's really interesting because I know Londos wasn't someone that wanted to shoot in the ring. I think he would say, "Oh, I would do that. If you want to shoot, we'll do it in the back or something." But in this case, maybe they were shooting on each other.
I'm sure they were testing each other a little bit here or there, but yeah,
doing a little bit of test of strength stuff. Sorry, I didn't
yeah.
interrupt.
No, that's okay. No, that's a great point. Londos is like all guys who really were good shooters. They're not going to do it in public. That's reserved for the back room at the Y at an appropriate time. No, if the guys who are really tough, JG, they don't have to show you how tough they are. Right? But anyways, they lock up in this in this match, exchanging holds back and forth. It was a little bit shorter than the usual matches, which would go an hour or two. It was under an hour. And Londos finally is able to get Lewis in a pinning position. And going back and reading the descriptions of the match and the finality with which Londos finally got Lewis, it seems to me, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that Londos really fought the pin, that he didn't lay down and take the count, because they struggled on. Londos turned him over, got him in a hammerlock, a half Nelson, and just pressed and pressed and pressed for about 2 or 3 minutes. Was that by design? I don't know. Did it make it look real? Oh, you bet. And then finally, Londos is able to turn him over, and get the count. One, two, three. And it's the count that he had waited 17 years for. And if I could go back and find Londos and talk to him telepathically through whatever digital device will be invented in our futures, I would like to ask him, what did it feel like when you stood up and you had achieved your lifelong dream? Not to win the world championship for your father, not to win the world championship for Greece, but to beat your arch rival, one, two, three, in the middle of the ring with the whole country, heck, the whole world watching. I would love to know what he would have thought. Um, but then again, he was a very quiet man. He probably would have just shrugged his shoulders and said, Ed gave me a good match.
It's a fascinating story because I think the Strangler Lewis Londos feud, it's one of those sort of feuds where you're like, they definitely had real jealousy or animosity towards each other. Lewis didn't like the younger new kid on the block type deal. And it's like, well, what was real, what wasn't?
It is. I could have written a whole book about Londos and Lewis, and in fact, that was what the book was at one point in time, was kind of a rivalry thing. But the thing is, to be able to tell the story of Londos versus Lewis, you have to be able to go back, especially in Londos's part, to the beginning and explain who he was and how it was he got to that point in Chicago in 1934, that this meant so much to him. And just the training alone for the match, he's running around lakes, he's exercising all day long, very visibly and very publicly. It's not like he just, blew into town on a chartered WWE jet and walked to the ring. This was a serious match, and it was shown to be a serious match by the way he approached it, and Lewis approached it as well in the days and the weeks running up to the actual event.
I know we can't cover every single big match he had, but I know he had some legendary bouts against Dick Shakot, Bronco Nagurski, and Ray Still. Are there any matches that you think people should know about or that stood out in his career other than the Strangler Lewis match and the matches in Greece?
Yeah, I'll give you one late in his career that really sums up who Londos was, even though it's not a particularly important event. So in 1959, he goes on his final tour at the age of 65 of Australia and New Zealand. Yeah. It was a charity event, but he's 65. He's not moving particularly well. He's there really more for the name than anything else. On occasion, he's wrestling Primo Carnera. They did for many years. They're kind of this ex-boxing world champion, ex-wrestling world champion, mixing it up a little bit, getting crowds more for the name than for the actual excitement in the ring. But on this tour of Australia and New Zealand in 59, end of his career, he's fighting the Big K, Stan Kowalski, who already was a pretty darn good heel in the US and Canada as one half of Murder Incorporated. There was no question about his underhanded tactics. So I asked Stan before he passed a few years ago about that match he had with Londos. He had a couple matches with him. And what he said, I think, spoke worlds about the way Londos was viewed within the wrestling profession. He said, you didn't go out there and punch him. Now, that's a big deal. Stan Kowalski punched everybody. But he said to go out there and punch him was a sign of disrespect. And you didn't do that to him. You respected this man so much that you went out there and wrestled with him. Now you lose, of course. That's part of the script. But you didn't do the kinds of things, the eye gouges, the punches, the kicks to the groin, that a typical heel would do in the 50s and 60s and all the way up to today, because it was a sign of disrespect toward this great performer. To me, that says a lot. And I suspect, although I couldn't interview wrestlers who worked with Londos in the 40s and the 50s outside of Stan, that probably was pretty much the case with a lot of them. that it was a little different when they got in the ring with Londos, and it made his matches a little bit different. So they might not have been exciting, thrilling matches like the one in Athens, but they're worth looking at and remembering as a way that wrestling really probably has never been conducted in quite the same way since.
Just a few more things I want to touch on briefly here. Um, I was really interested in learning about what you learned in your research about the sort of cutthroat behind the scenes world of pro wrestling in researching this uh, biography of Londos, because people think, oh, the 90s WCW versus WWE, that was cutthroat, but it was cutthroat in the 30s when you had the Toots Mon characters, the Gold Dust Trio, and there was infights with Jack Curley and his group, the Trust. There was basically promoters were trying to create their own monopolies. I mean, this was a cutthroat business, and Jim Londos is on top while a lot of this is happening. Jack Pfeffer, one of the big promoters, who's now becoming more well known because of the, I believe the movie was called Queen of the Ring. He
Yeah.
came out in the 30s and said, "Yeah, it's all fixed." And this is all happening as sort of combat between different promoters, as I understand it. Have you looked into that at all? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, a lot on that. Let's put it this way. If you considered WWE and WCW in the 90s to be a promotional war, the promoters of the 20s and 30s made them look like Dick and Jane are booking a wrestling match. These guys, um, Pfeffer on down, some of the other guys, Tootsmont, Luthez once said of Tootsmont, he would steal the cream off your coffee. Okay. That's the kind of folk you were dealing with um, as head of the wrestling business. So Londos has to be aware that he's not only possibly facing a double cross in the ring, he's facing a double cross from promoters. It's enormously difficult to have any level of trust in these guys. In the book, I described the promoters of the 1920s and the various alliances kind of like going into World War I in Europe. Everybody was allied with everybody and opposed to everybody at the same time. You had no idea if these alliances were shifting in the sand tonight or tomorrow or the next day. It was it was a mess. Um, so you had world title fabrications out of nowhere, tournaments, world championship tournaments out of nowhere, people declared champions out of nowhere, promoters breaking with each other, then deciding to work together, then screwing each other in the back. These guys, the OJs were writing about the wrestling promoters of the 1920s when they sang The Backstabber. Um, that's a really good way of putting it. So Londos has to navigate that. It's very difficult because until 1928, he was his own manager. He did bring in Ed White to help advocate his case after that. Um, but even the detente that was signed between promoters in 1933, that was designed to give Londos a clear shot at the world championship, broke down after 2 years because people didn't trust each other. Um, and
It's almost like these promoters, they had little alliances that were all trying to be their own little cartels.
tell me if you heard this about a pro wrestling promoter before. They couldn't see past tomorrow. The long range planning was not a strength. It was whatever we could do moment to moment, and the plans for 3 or 5 years from now be damned. Londos probably benefited in that he had, by nature of his Greek background and his bearing, a preference for long range planning, for understanding the long game from the time he was a kid and decided to get into wrestling all the way through the rest of his career. So he probably looked at it a little bit differently than most people did. He looked at the long game. But to do that, you had to constantly walk around the minefields that promoters were setting where uh, you can come and wrestle for me, Jim, but first you have to go through this guy. No, I'm not going to go through that guy. He's your guy. That might be a double cross. I want a clean referee. No, you're not going to get a clean referee. You're going to get my referee. Um, Londos was double crossed or approached for double cross many times, and that's a big deal. It's I know the Michaels Hart thing has dominated wrestling discussion for the last 30 years, but as you said earlier, it was going on long before that and in just as vituperative a form, if not more so.
With regards to some of these promoters that we mentioned, who were the biggest sort of winners when it came to Londos? So, what promoters made the most money because of the Londos phenomenon?
Probably Tom Pax of St. Louis was Londos's preferred promoter until they broke in the late 1930s. Um, but the guy who probably did the best by Londos was a gentleman named John Contos. John Contos specialized in going into new areas and opening up territories, just like we talk about opening up territories in the 40s or the 50s, going into places like and promoting in places like Atlanta and Memphis and upstate New York. He promoted the match in 1933 in Athens. So Contos would go into an area that really hadn't been tapped, bring in Londos. Usually Londos would get a piece of the action, a little cut of the promotion or an extra cut of the gate or something like that, which was very smart of him because that meant he always had some kind of assured income and some kind of assured work through his little network of promoters. John Contos was probably the most important in terms of on a day-to-day basis, year-to-year basis with Londos. Then they ended up in the 1950s co-owning Phoenix, the Phoenix territory, and Little Madison Square Garden. So it was a relationship that extended from the late 19 teens into the 50s. So the relationship extended for about 40 years. It was definitely the longest relationship Jim had with any particular promoter.
I wanted to ask you too about. I mentioned Jack Curley earlier, and I think in the book there's a whole thing where Curley went after Londos in the press because he was worried about Londos setting up his own business elsewhere, or that there was some palace intrigues. And I think you compared the falling out between Curley and Londos to it was like the New York Yankees shoving Babe Ruth out the door. Did you
That's
what was
exactly
that
right.
all about?
We still don't know for sure. There's some evidence in documentary records at Notre Dame. At the University of Notre Dame houses promoter Jack Pfeffer's collection of scribbles and scrabbles and clips. And if you go through them carefully, you can kind of divine a few things. But we really don't have a good solid first-hand account. For some reason, after Londos was doing remarkable business in New York City, Curley decided he wanted, and I'm using his words here, not mine, an Italian champion. Okay. I don't know if he was playing an ethnic card or if he thought Londos was getting too big for his britches. He might have been. And so Curley defamed Londos in print and on the radio, his biggest drawing card. You don't usually talk about your biggest drawing card that way. And it caused a break in the New York market that it never really quite recovered from compared to the early days of Londos' success in New York. So a lot of folks, wiser folks than me, guys like Steve Yohe and Tim Hornbaker have tried to figure out why was Curley doing that? You know, why would you take a swipe at your best drawing card? He had his reasons, but his reasons don't look particularly solid 100 years later. Eventually, he did make up with Londos. Londos came back to New York and wrestled there in the 30s until Curley passed away in 37. It might have been that Curley was trying to get out of the business. He was getting old, having health issues. Maybe he wanted to hand it off to somebody else. Maybe Toots Mondt was interfering with activities. It's hard to tell. But ordinarily, as you say, you don't the Yankees don't put Babe Ruth on waivers, and Jack Curley probably made a mistake when he said Jim Londos wasn't drawing the kind of crowds that an Italian champion could have drawn.
Before we close out here, um, you know, I think this story is very interesting, given that we're in a time where, sadly, immigrants are under fire in the U.S. right now. Um, Do you want to comment on how this book is prescient for the time we're in?
JG, I wrote something on that the other day for a post for something else, and the post began. Sadly, at a time when immigration is under fire in the US, dot, 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 drawing on Londos, it's hard to imagine, given where we are in immigration and rolling up the borders and a solid dose of the xenophobia that we've seen in recent years, it's hard to understand that this little Greek immigrant was the most important sports figure in the world for a period of time. And as Jim Ross, Jr., says in the book, is the man who saved the wrestling business.
Real quick, not to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I want to pinpoint that real quick. People can look in the book. You talk about the attendances for Madison Square Garden before the Londos matches. The wrestling matches before Londos was around did not sell as well at Madison Square Garden. He comes around and they're selling like hotcakes. So go on.
And he leaves, and Madison Square Garden is closed for more than a dozen years to wrestling. Okay.
Right. That's exactly, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah, it is. So, like I say, JR says, he's the man who saved the wrestling business. Yeah, maybe a slight exaggeration, but you can certainly make that point, and the evidence points that direction. So, who did this? This is an immigrant from Southern Europe. We talked earlier about how Greek immigrants were viewed in the United States and in other parts of North America. You can be successful. You can inspire people. You can tell a story that leaves people with a lesson to take home with them. And it doesn't necessarily matter what the country of origin is on your birth certificate. That's a solid lesson, I think, to remember today.
Just two more things briefly here. I wanted to cover. Why do you think it's taken so long for Jim Londos to be reconsidered? And I see more and more people, including yourself, drawing a light on him. It was only a few short years ago when I learned about Londos through the work of wrestling historian MacFarland, who was going through some of the biggest draws. And he said, well, Londos
my
is
good friend
huge.
Matt, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think for years, even when you talk about the wrestlers of yesteryear, the pre-Hulk Hogan wrestlers like a loose Thez or Ed the Strangler Lewis or Buddy Rogers, you didn't always hear about Jim Londos. Why is that? Why has he been sort of left out of the equation?
There's a couple
I
of
know
reasons.
that's speculative too, but
Oh, no,
yeah.
it's not speculative. He has been. History has missed the boat on this guy, in my opinion, in the opinion of a lot of wrestling historians and researchers. Okay, a couple of reasons. Number one, he was a Greek immigrant, not the all-American Jack Armstrong type that you would model an action figure or a play doll after. Okay. Number two, he came along before the TV age. TV age really changed just about everything. He had a few TV matches in the early 50s, but a lot of people think wrestling began with TV and Gorgeous George in 1948 and don't realize that wrestling had a whole rich history before that. There was less, stylish or less ostentatious. To me, though, the big reason is that in the latter part of Londos's career, wrestling fell off the map. It was taken seriously, as we discussed, into the early 30s in media and in other outlets. Londos would perform posing exhibitions along with famous people in various places. It was a legitimate, respectable, maybe in air quotes, respectable sport. In 36, when Dick Shycat shot on Dano O'Mahony, Londos' successor, that started a chain reaction of events that we could talk about for the next 5 hours, but it ended up, the net effect was the end of wrestling as a national sport with national storylines. Um,
What was the big reason? Why did that incident do that?
Londos had defeated Dick for the championship in 1930. Dick always wanted another shot at the championship. Dano O'Mahony was the designated Irish immigrant successor to Londos. His major problem was that he couldn't wrestle his way out of the paper bag. And so he was continually being challenged by folks who would double cross it. Um, Dick double crossed him in 1936. Dick then put the world title up for sale to the highest bidder. Within 4 or 5 months, instead of one world championship, you had nine. Okay. Um, the whole affair ended up in a court in Columbus, Ohio, a federal court. And the last place wrestling needs to be is in a federal court with people testifying to the truth. So you had days and days of headlines of how wrestling was fake, how Gus Sonnenberg had opponents set up for him under different names, although it was actually the same person. And wrestling, which had, sort of a so-so reputation to begin with, just dropped off a cliff. Nobody took it seriously after that. It was the end of wrestling as a national sport. So Londos is still active. He's abroad while a lot of this stuff is happening. When he comes back and wins the world championship again, but it's to a much diminished sport. The crowds are not quite as big. He's still the best thing wrestling has going. And sports writers still say he is the throwback to the days before wrestling went silly. But now the silliness has pretty much taken over. And the wrestling results in newspapers are no longer splashed across the top of the headline, but they're back in the tire ads.
I wanted to ask, as you mentioned, I should have asked earlier, but I didn't know if you thought it was worthwhile to cover it. But you mentioned that Dano Mahoney was sort of the successor to Londos, and I think he even beat Londos in a match.
Right.
And he was really built up. I think he had like 49 consecutive wins. The promoter Paul Bowser really pushed him.
It's like Goldberg.
Yeah, that's what. Well, I was going to make the comparison to Goldberg.
Push to the moon.
How important is what can we say about the O'Mahony story as it relates to the story of Jim Londos?
By 1935, Londos was getting tired of wrestling 130, 140 nights a year. Now remember, he's not jetting. He's going by railroad, rail car from place to place. It's an exhausting travel. He's ready to finally drop the belt. Under the terms of the agreement he has with various promoters, he's got a $50,000 deposit that he's going to get when he finally drops the belt. Paul Bowser of Boston was one of the influential promoters. He's the guy who brought Dano O'Mahony over from Ireland as the next world champion. The thinking is, well, we had the Greek champion, but in Boston, an Irishman's really going to do good. This good-looking young kid. He can't wrestle or anything, but we can cover for him. We can get him in against favorable opponents. He'll have his own special referee doing his matches and so forth. So Londos sort of takes this sigh of relief, loses the belt, 1, 2, 3 in the middle of the ring to O'Mahony, which is not something all champions were willing to do. Goes off, takes some time off, buys some property in California, the basis for his farm. O'Mahony in 35 and 36, it's clear that he's very beatable. Anybody can handle him if he gets himself in an unprotected situation. And one of the things that I found, JG, toward the end of the research, it was just this little nugget buried in the library at Notre Dame, that there was actually a meeting in 1936 among some of the friendly promoters to put Londos back on top. That O'Mahony had had his run or so of a year. Box offices had dropped. Let's go back to proven, tried and true winner, Londos. So they were actually making arrangements and discussions for another match in which Londos would regain the title from O'Mahony, probably draw a pretty good crowd if that was built up right in a place like St. Louis or New York. But before they could implement that plan, Dick Shekat went ahead and shot on O'Mahony and took the belt. And so the best laid plans of mice and men fell into the gutter.
That's such an interesting story because it reminds me of Bruno again, where you had Bruno hold the belt for I think like I don't know 7 years or something. Then he loses it. It gets passed off to Pedro Morales for a few years, and then Bruno gets another run. They went back to the well, and it sounds like they wanted to do that with Jim Londos again. So that's very interesting how history repeats itself. Do you think it says a lot that he was willing to bow out gracefully and give Dano O'Mahony the win?
Yeah, I think it says a lot about that. Now, that was the last time he ever lost. He made sure that would never happen again. Uh, but then again, if he lost after that, then he wouldn't have been Jim Londos. There were some possible opponents for him in later years where he might have gone to a draw to give the rub to somebody. But the decision after essentially 5 years as champion, more or less, to pass the belt on to O'Mahony made a lot of sense for him personally. Um, he was tired. He was run down. You can see the newspapers in those days would run the weight of the wrestler in the little column. Jim Londos, 198, Jim Londos, 196. You can see over a period of time his weight's starting to drop. Okay. They were not worked weights. You can see he's losing a pounder here, pound or two here, just probably from being on the road and traveling all the time. So when he loses to O'Mahony, he's 41 years old, okay, which we would consider to be ancient, but he was just getting going. I don't know if he intended to come back and win the belt later on, but that was obviously the plan. It just never got around to that point.
So I know I've kept you overly long, but I do have to ask, since this is a book from the studies in strength and physical culture, how important is Londo's story, just if you're interested in physical culture?
He was an amazing guy when it comes to physical culture. Yeah.
He was unlike a lot of wrestlers too. I don't think he engaged in drinking and going to the bars all the time like some wrestlers do.
There was virtually no drinking. There was no cigarette. There was no steak or red meat. He was, like Tom Brady has his trainer and he eats nothing but kale and vitamin water or something like that. Londos had a similarly restrictive diet, but it's really important. He wrote, I included a little bit in the book, but he wrote a long piece about physical culture and the history of physical culture from the Greeks on down to the present time that he would deliver as speeches or talks in San Diego after he was retired. When we see a wrestler or a basketball player or a baseball player or a football player today after winning, the first thing they do is the reporter asks them, well, how do you attribute this? Oh, it's just an incredible amount of hard work. You got to put everything into it. We've put everything into it, and this finally pays off. These guys were pikers compared to Londos. They have no idea what hard work meant. Londos fell asleep with dumbbells on his chest in one little story I relate in the book. He was obsessed with physical culture, obsessed with the body, which he believed was the greatest invention ever put on earth. And there's some descriptions of the kinds of things in the book that he did to keep himself in shape well into his 60s. That is, again, aside from the wrestling, just a really good lesson for anybody to follow.
And in closing, I also wanted to ask, I know that you've written about Londos, sort of comparing him to figures from mythology, particularly Jason from Jason
Yes.
and the Argonauts. I was interested in talking about that.
I went back and forth with Vicky, my translator and researcher, talking about mythology because the Greek newspapers in writing about Londos, actually raised him to sort of a mythological figure. So at first we started thinking, well, maybe the Iliad, where he's embarked like Odysseus on this long journey across troubled waters and so forth. But then I don't remember exactly how it came up, but we both kind of struck on the same idea. No, he is Jason of the Argonauts. He's a young guy in search of identity, sailing in troubled waters. Jason was at odds with his duplicitous half uncle. Londos was at odds with his dad. They're going through all kinds of terrors and tremors. Jason had to pass Scylla and Charybdis. Londos had to pass wrestling promoters of the 1920s. I don't know who'd win in those matches. Those would have been battle royals. So, although the Jason story has a little bit different ending, Londos is a lot like that mythological story of Jason, a young man out on a quest for the Golden Fleece. Except, not to sound trite in this instance, the quest is not for the Golden Fleece, but for the Golden Championship belt.
I just remembered, I believe you've said elsewhere that this book came about in part because of a previous book that another author wrote on Gorgeous George, a wrestler who really defined pro wrestling in the television era before Hulk Hogan. And it's interesting. I would be interested in your comparing and contrasting Gorgeous George and Jim Londos because it's interesting in some ways. George is a man that has a very tragic ending with alcoholism and decline. Londos, I think, has almost like the storybook ending.
That was one of the impetuses for writing the book. John Capuya wrote that great book on Gorgeous George. John's having some health issues here, and we always have our prayers for him because he's a great guy. He wrote this wonderful book on Gorgeous George and positioned him correctly, in my estimation, as kind of the first of the post-war pop culture bad boy athletes. The look at me kind of uh, Deion Sanders, Floyd Mayweather, Muhammad Ali kind of athlete. And I read John's book and talked with him about it. But you're correct. George comes to a bad ending. He battled alcoholism, uh, died at an early age. Not exactly the kind of ending you want in a Disney movie. Londos kind of struck me as the anti-George. George's star ascended rather quickly and descended even more rapidly. Londos wrestled over a career of 45 years. George squandered a lot of his money. Londos left a wonderful farm for his family, had a great reputation as a civic leader in the Chamber of Commerce. Uh, he was, in many ways, the anti-George. Londos was flamboyant for his time, but not in a way in which he was wearing sequined capes and dispensing bobby pins or having a valet spray atomizer on an opponent before the match. So the really interesting thing to me, JG, is that when Londos entered and got a little bit theatrical, the old time wrestlers from the early part of the 20th century said, this is awful. Wrestling's going to hell. This is terrible. It's not like it was in the old days. Yet as Londos matures and Gorgeous George takes over, the wrestlers are looking at, and fans are looking at Gorgeous George and saying, this is awful. Wrestling is going to hell. It's not like in the old days when Jim Londos was wrestling. Each generation seems to have a constant.
What would wrestlers of Londos's time, the old scholars, have said about Londos that they didn't like it? Was it because I've seen the little footage that exists of Londos? He does things. I've seen him do an airplane spin. Is that something that they may have taken issue with?
Yeah, I think they would take an issue with an airplane spin. Um, Londos invented the sleeper hold. Londos invented the sleeper hold. If he has no other role in wrestling, he should be remembered for inventing the sleeper hold. Um, how many kids have slapped a sleeper hold on their brothers in the basement of their houses over the course of years? So that's something. Is that true wrestling? That's not a hammerlock or a top wrist lock, sleeper hold. What kind of thing is that? So uh, Londos would reach out with pursed lips and reddened eyes, slapping the mat, trying to reach out to fans. Wrestlers didn't do that. They took their punishment like a man. Um, so it was easy to see where some wrestlers would have a problem with that. But the folks I talked to over a period of years who knew him had nothing but respect for him. And it's probably summed up in one word: money. You respect somebody who can draw you money. A rising tide lifts all boats. And Londos lifted all boats in the 20s and 30s in a way that they had never been lifted before and would never be lifted again by a single person. That's not to diminish Hogan or Cena or anybody else,
But they
but
had a machine behind them. Yeah.
yeah, they have a publicly, or at one time, a publicly traded company behind them. Um, Londos had some Greek friends in St. Louis.
Well, hey, I think this is a great note to end on, but I know that this book took you uh well, 12 years, I think just of research, and then about 18 months writing it on a full-time basis. You also, I want people to note that you had a researcher and translator who helped with this book from Athens. I don't want to botch their name. Maybe you could tell my listeners about them, but I just want you to talk about the level of research that went into this book, because this is a journalistic feat, this book you've written.
Thanks. When I started this, I collected clippings and information and documents about Londos in North America, and I could have written the book on that basis, but it only would have been about 30% of the story. To get at Londos and get at the Greek aspect, I needed to do more research in Greece, and that took a real long time because I do not read or speak Greek. I'm I'm barely okay in English sometimes, but Greek is all Greek to me. Um, so the process of the research was a couple of my fellow wrestling historians helped me go in and find some Greek newspapers that were archived online. Um, we grabbed them while we could. Unfortunately, they're no longer available, so we did a great job of getting what we could while we could. Um, and I reached out to Vasiliki Mutsori of Athens, a researcher and translator. I couldn't have done this book without her. She translated gobs and gobs of newspapers and magazines and books and publications that were essential to telling the story because Londos was much more open with the Greek press than he was with the American press. Maybe he was suspicious of the American press. Maybe it was a language thing and he couldn't quite express himself the way he could in Greek. So going through those things and placing them properly was difficult, but absolutely essential to understanding Londos in Greece. And then I had the help of a couple of professors as well, Alexander Kitroff of Haverford University, in kind of looking at the Greece of Jim Londos's time and why Greece needed a hero after years of economic strife and war and defeat and humiliation. So once I was able to kind of put those things together on the Greek side of things, it became a lot easier to understand who Londos was and what he came from.
One thing I was interested in with the research was I know you said that you really had to familiarize yourself with the immigration patterns of the early 20th century. What did you mean by that, and why are the immigration patterns so important to understanding the book?
I had no conception of the degree of immigration from Greece to the United States in the early part of the century. Okay. Um, it's interesting on two levels. Number one, it explains the difficulties that were going on in Greece and why the country itself was experiencing hard times. And then you extrapolate that into a country undergoing hard times needs a hero. Here's a hero. Okay. Um, And then you also look at the dispersal of Greeks to the United States. Like I said, 390,000 in the first quarter of the century. Boy, that's a built-in audience for him. Okay. He is their cousin, not formally, but informally. He is their cousin, and he has 390,000 fans who have come from across the Atlantic Ocean who are anxious to follow the way that one of their fellow immigrants has progressed in his athletic career. So the immigration plays a really big part of it, even beyond what we talked about earlier, with the recognition that an immigrant can succeed and that there's a reason to treat people like that with respect as opposed to tearing things down.
What was the line that Greeks would say about Londos? Wasn't it Zito Londos?
Zito Londos, long live Londos. You could hear it from the crowd. Zito Londos. I'm not saying it very well, but Zito Londos, long live Londos, long live Greece.
Wow.
Never heard that for another wrestler. But again, he means that much to him. And anywhere he went in the 30s, it was not uncommon for him to have a banquet before or after the match, or the day of, or the day before, hosted by a local Greek society. So again, there's a built-in audience. There's a story in the book. I don't mean to belabor you either, but there's a story in the book from Don Leo Jonathan, who met him and whose father knew him pretty well. That when Londos traveled around the country, he didn't stay at the Marriott Atlanta or the Central Park Plaza or the Hampton Inn in Chicago. He stayed at the home of Greek followers across the country, ordinary people, ordinary Greeks. That says an incredible amount for having and maintaining the common touch with your folks, even if you're up here and they're kind of down at a lower level. I can't imagine today's wrestlers going around and saying, gee, I'm in Pittsburgh. Let's see if Mark Madden has a bed for the night. Or going to New York City and bunking with somebody who has an apartment in the Bronx. Yet Londos had that little extra touch where he would be true to his countrymen even when he's on the road.
Well, all I got to say is Zito Londos, long live Londos, and I'm so glad that you're doing him justice because it's well deserved. I mean, this book, I can't stress enough. This book is an accomplishment on your part. There's not a lot of people could have tackled this topic. I mean, this is from, 100 years ago almost. So, the fact that you were able to pull this off, kudos to you. Thank you so much. I hope everyone checks out the book. Jim Londos, the Golden Greek of professional wrestling. Thank you so much, Steve Johnson. It means a great deal to have had you on the show to discuss this book.
Well, thanks for having me on. I enjoy it. And anybody who wants to ask a question can always find me on Twitter or X at SteelBeltSteve if you want to follow up.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.